The finest carriage in 3 counties sat motionless in front of Murphy's General Store, its polished brass fittings gleaming like accusations in the harsh afternoon sun. Margaret Thornfield gripped the leather reins with white knuckles, her emerald silk dress already wilting in the heat despite the parasol's shade. She had expected many things when she decided to adopt an orphan boy: gratitude, perhaps some tears of joy, certainly the kind of touching scene that would cement her reputation as a woman of both means and heart. She had not expected him to take one look at her and ask, "You plannin' to keep me like a pet canary in that fancy cage?" The boy stood in the dusty street, all of 12 years old and barely reaching her shoulder, his dark hair hanging in uneven chunks around a face that seemed too knowing for his age. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn thin at the heels. Every respectable citizen of Cedar Ridge had gathered to witness what they'd assumed would be a heartwarming moment: the territory's most successful rancher taking pity on a poor orphan. Instead, they watched Margaret Thornfield's carefully composed expression crumble like dry adobe. "I beg your pardon?" she managed, her voice pitched higher than usual. Tommy Garrett tilted his head, studying her with the same intensity she'd seen in her prize bulls evaluating a threat. "Well, ma'am, you got yourself all dressed up like you're headin' to a church social, drivin' a rig that costs more than most folks see in a year, and you're lookin' at me like I'm supposed to jump up and down with gratitude." He kicked at a clod of dirt with the toe of his boot. "Just wonderin' if you expect me to sing pretty songs for your lady friends when they come callin'." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house pressed her gloved hand to her chest. Old Pete from the livery stable removed his hat and scratched his balding head. Even the Reverend Morrison, who'd been beaming just moments before, now looked as though he might need to sit down. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck that had nothing to do with the blazing sun. This was not how it was supposed to go. She'd planned this moment for months, had even practiced the words she'd say when she first met the boy who would become her son. Words about fresh starts and proper education and the advantages of joining the Thornfield name. "Tommy," the Reverend interjected quickly, "Miss Thornfield has been most generous in her offer to—" "I know what she's off-airin'," Tommy said, not taking his eyes off Margaret. "Question is, does she know what she's a skin for?" The silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Margaret could feel every eye in Cedar Ridge watching, waiting to see if the formidable businesswoman who'd built a cattle empire from nothing could handle one impertinent boy. Her pride demanded she drive away, leave the ungrateful child to fend for himself. But something in his steady gaze, something that looked almost like a test, made her pause. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you could tell me what you think I'm asking for." Tommy's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door opening just a crack. "Reckon that depends on whether you want the truth or what you want to hear." Margaret found herself leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious now despite her embarrassment. "The truth, I think. You're buying yourself a family, ma'am. Problem is, family ain't for sale." His voice was matter-of-fact, without cruelty. "You can buy me a bed and clothes and shoe lin, but you can't buy what makes a family real. That's got to be earned on both sides." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because they were meant to wound, but because they were true. Standing there in her expensive dress, surrounded by witnesses to her humiliation, she realized this 12-year-old boy had seen straight through her. She had expected gratitude, compliance, instant affection, everything money couldn't actually purchase. "I see," she said quietly, her voice nearly lost in the afternoon stillness. Tommy took a step closer, and for the first time, his expression gentled. "Don't mean it can't be earned, though. Just means it ain't gonna happen, 'cause you wave a bankroll around." Margaret looked down at this boy who spoke with the wisdom of someone far older, who'd somehow managed to humble her without cruelty, and felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what the proud Margaret Thornfield would do next. The Thornfield Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, its whitewashed buildings and neat corrals speaking of prosperity and order. Margaret had built it from nothing after her family's death, turning grief and determination into the largest cattle operation in the territory. Now, as her carriage rolled up the drive with Tommy sitting silent beside her, she wondered if all her success meant anything at all. "Big place," Tommy observed, his first word since they'd left town. "Yes." Margaret smoothed her skirts, unsure what else to say. The silence had stretched for the entire hour-long ride, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. "Must get awful quiet." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. He wasn't mocking the grandeur or fishing for compliments about his new circumstances. He was simply stating a fact, and somehow that observation cut deeper than any criticism could have. "Sometimes," she admitted. Tommy nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Thought so. Big places usually are." They pulled up to the main house, a sprawling structure of native stone and timber that had taken Margaret 5 years to complete. She designed every room with care, imagining the family gatherings and celebrations that would fill it with life. Instead, it had remained as quiet and empty as a museum. Maria Santos, her longtime housekeeper, emerged onto the wide porch, her weathered face creased with curiosity. Behind her lurked several ranch hands who'd found sudden urgent business near the house. Word traveled fast on the frontier, and Margaret knew the entire ranch would be buzzing with speculation about the boy within the hour. "This is Tommy," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority she used in business dealings. "He'll be staying with us." "Welcome, Mijo," Maria said warmly, switching effortlessly from the formal deference she showed Margaret to genuine maternal warmth. "You hungry? I got fresh bread and honey." Tommy's first real smile of the day appeared. "Yes, ma'am, if it's no trouble." "No trouble at all." Maria shot a meaningful look at Margaret. "Come, I'll show you to your room, then we eat." As they disappeared into the house, Margaret remained on the porch, suddenly uncertain. She'd run this ranch with military precision for years, but now she felt like a stranger in her own home. Through the open window, she could hear Maria's voice chattering in rapid Spanish, punctuated by Tommy's occasional responses. The sound of easy conversation in her house was so foreign it made her chest tight. "He seems like a smart boy," said a voice behind her. Margaret turned to find Jake Morrison, her ranch foreman and the Reverend's younger brother, leaning against the porch rail. Jake had worked for her since the early days, one of the few men who'd been willing to take orders from a woman. His opinion mattered more than most. "Smart enough to see right through me, apparently." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Jake studied her with the same careful attention he gave to sick cattle. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." "How do you figure?" "Well, most folks around here spend so much time tiptoeing around you and your money, they forget you're human." He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Boy treats you like a person, not a bank account." "Seems refreshing to me." Margaret considered this. "He humiliated me in front of half the town." "He told you the truth in front of half the town," Jake corrected. "Not quite the same thing." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival. Charles Whitman, president of the Cattlemen's Association and owner of the second-largest ranch in the territory, rode up with his usual air of self-importance. Behind him came several other ranchers, their faces grave. "Margaret," Whitman called out as he dismounted. "We need to talk." "Gentlemen," she replied, instantly slipping back into her business persona. "What brings you out here?" "Heard about your adoption." Whitman's tone made it sound like a disease. "We have concerns." Jake shifted beside her, and Margaret felt rather than saw his protective stance. "What sort of concerns, Charles?" "Look, Margaret, nobody questions your business sense. You've built something impressive here. But raising a child? That requires qualities you haven't exactly demonstrated." Heat flared in Margaret's chest. "Such as, well, patience. The ability to put someone else's needs first." Whitman's voice carried the condescending tone of a man explaining something obvious. "You're a fine businesswoman, but motherhood requires a softer touch." "That boy needs stability, not sentiment," added Porter Hayes, owner of the Bar H Ranch. "He needs a firm hand and clear expectations, not to be coddled." From inside the house came the sound of laughter, Tommy's young voice mingling with Maria's maternal chuckles. The sound made Margaret's heart clench with something between longing and fear. The Cattlemen's Association has a reputation to maintain, Whitman continued. Our members are pillars of the community, examples of proper family values. We can't have questions about the suitability of our leadership. Are you threatening me, Charles? I'm offering friendly advice. There's talk already about whether someone so unmaternal should be responsible for a child. People are wondering if this isn't just another business acquisition for you. Margaret felt the familiar ice settle in her veins, the cold control that had served her in countless business negotiations. I see. And what would satisfy your concerns? Prove you can raise him properly. The boy needs to learn respect, discipline, gratitude. He needs to understand his place and his good fortune. Whitman remounted his horse. The association dinner is next month. Bring him. Let us see how well he's adapting to his new circumstances. As the group rode away, Margaret remained frozen on her porch, their words echoing in her mind. Everything she'd fought to build, every ounce of respect she'd earned in a man's world, suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. Don't listen to them, Jake said quietly. Maybe they're right. The admission came out as barely more than a whisper. Maybe I don't know the first thing about being a mother. Maybe not, Jake agreed. But you know about being decent. That's a start. Through the window, Margaret could see Tommy helping Maria set the table, his movements careful and considerate. When Maria said something that made him laugh, his whole face transformed, revealing the child hidden beneath his too serious exterior. For the first time in years, Margaret Thornfield wondered if all her success meant nothing at all if she couldn't figure out how to connect with one lonely boy. The annual Cattlemen's Association dinner was the social event of the year, a chance for the territory's elite to display their prosperity and influence. Margaret had attended every year since establishing her ranch, using the evening to conduct business and maintain the relationships that kept her empire thriving. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a trial. Tommy sat beside her in the decorated barn that served as the venue, wearing his first new suit, dark wool that made his serious eyes seem even more intense. He'd said little during the ride to town, but Margaret had caught him studying her with that unnerving perception of his. You're nervous, he'd observed. I'm never nervous. Then why'd you change dresses 3 times? She'd had no answer for that. Now, surrounded by the territory's most influential families, Margaret felt every eye cataloging Tommy's behavior, every ear tuned to his words. Charles Whitman had positioned himself directly across from them, his wife Eleanor surveying Tommy like a jeweler examining a questionable diamond. So, young man, Whitman boomed during the soup course, I trust you're properly grateful for Miss Thornfield's generosity? Tommy looked up from his bowl, spoon poised halfway to his mouth. Grateful for what, sir? An uncomfortable silence fell over their section of the long table. Margaret felt her stomach clench. For rescuing you from poverty, of course. For giving you a home, education, opportunities you never could have imagined. Tommy set down his spoon with deliberate care. Begging your pardon, sir, but Miss Thornfield didn't rescue me from anything. She made me an offer and I accepted it. Seemed like we both got something out of the deal. Eleanor Whitman's eyebrows shot toward her hairline. My dear child, surely you understand the magnitude of your good fortune? You've gone from having nothing to being part of one of the territory's most prominent families. Had plenty before I came here, ma'am. Had my health, my wits, my ability to work. Still got all those things. Tommy's voice remained respectful but firm. Miss Thornfield's got herself a son now, if we both work at it. Seems fair to me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret could see the other guests exchanging meaningful glances, could practically hear their thoughts. The boy was ungrateful, uncivilized, a poor reflection on his adoptive mother's judgment. Perhaps, suggested Judge Harrison from down the table, the boy needs more time to understand proper appreciation and respect. He understands just fine, Margaret heard herself say. Every head turned toward her, and she realized she'd spoken more sharply than intended. Tommy sees things clearly. Sometimes more clearly than adults do. The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. Margaret could feel the weight of disapproval settling around her like a shroud. When the evening speaker began his address about the importance of traditional family values, she barely heard the words over the rushing in her ears. It was during dessert that disaster struck. James Porter, Whitman's eldest son and heir to a considerable fortune, had been drinking steadily throughout the evening. His voice grew louder with each course, his comments more pointed. Finally, he leaned across the table toward Tommy. "Tell me, boy, what exactly did you do to earn Miss Thornfield's charity? Must have been quite a performance." Tommy went very still, and Margaret saw something flicker in his eyes, not hurt, but a calculating wariness that made her suddenly afraid. "James," she said quietly, "perhaps." No, I'm genuinely curious," James continued, emboldened by the alcohol and his audience. "We all know Margaret's got a head for business. She doesn't make investments without expecting returns. So what's your return on investment, boy? What's your special talent?" The entire barn had gone quiet now, even the servers pausing in their duties. Tommy looked at James Porter for a long moment, then at the faces around him, some curious, some hostile, some merely entertained by the spectacle. Finally he stood. "Well, sir," Tommy said in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, "I reckon my special talent is seein' what folks really need, even when they can't see it themselves." He turned to face the room, this 12-year-old boy in his new suit, and something in his bearing commanded attention. "Take you, for instance. You got yourself a fine suit, expensive watch, and enough money to drink yourself stupid in public. But what you really need is for someone to tell you that makin' sport of orphans don't make you bigger. It just makes you mean." A gasp rippled through the crowd. James Porter's face flushed red, but Tommy wasn't finished. "And Mrs. Whitman, you got yourself lovely jewelry and a fancy dress, but what you need is to remember that kindness don't cost nothin' extra. Might even make you feel better than lookin' down on folks does." He looked around the room with those knowing eyes, and Margaret saw several people shift uncomfortably under his gaze. "Most of y'all got more money than you know what to do with, fine houses, and respect from your neighbors. But half of you are lonelier than a wolf in winter, and the other half are so busy provin' how important you are that you forgot how to be decent." Tommy's voice softened, and he turned back to Margaret. "Miss Thornfield's got herself the biggest ranch in 3 counties, more money than she can spend, and a reputation that scares grown men. But what she needs is someone who ain't afraid to tell her the truth, someone who sees past all that armor she wears to the person underneath." He sat back down as calmly as if he'd just commented on the weather. "That's my special talent, Mr. Porter. I see what people need. And right now, what this whole room needs is to take a long look in the mirror and ask themselves when they stop treatin' other folks like human beings." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Tommy had just challenged the entire social order of their community, had called out their cruelty and hypocrisy with the unflinching honesty of a child who had nothing left to lose. Charles Whitman's face was purple with rage. "This is exactly what we were afraid of, Margaret. The boy is completely unsuitable, disrespectful, out of control." "He's the most honest person in this room," Margaret said quietly, but her voice carried in the stillness. "Everything he said was true." She stood, placing her hand gently on Tommy's shoulder. "And if you can't see that, if you're more concerned with maintaining your comfortable illusions than facing the truth, then perhaps the problem isn't with him." Without another word, Margaret guided Tommy toward the door, leaving behind the shocked whispers and outraged exclamations of the territory's elite. As they stepped into the cool night air, she realized her hands were shaking. "Reckon I messed things up for you," Tommy said quietly as they walked toward their carriage. Margaret stopped walking and looked down at this extraordinary boy who just defended her with more courage than any adult had ever shown. "You told them the truth. That's never a mistake, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it costs you friends?" Margaret glanced back at the barn, where she could see figures gesticulating angrily through the windows. Everything she'd worked to build in this community had just been shaken to its foundation. "Those weren't friends, Tommy. Friends don't ask you to pretend to be someone you're not." As they rode home through the star-filled darkness, Margaret found herself wondering if a 12-year-old boy had just taught her the most important lesson of her life. The house felt different when they returned from the dinner, as though Tommy's words had somehow changed the very air inside. Margaret sat in her study, still wearing her formal dress but with her shoes kicked off, staring at the cold fireplace. Through the window, she could see Tommy on the front porch, sitting on the steps and looking out at the star-filled sky. She should have been furious with him. His outburst had probably cost her decades of carefully cultivated relationships, might even threaten her standing in the Cattlemen's Association. Instead, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a lightness, as though she'd been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Tommy appeared in the doorway, having changed from his suit into work clothes. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret gestured to the leather chair across from her desk. "Can't sleep? Could ask you the same thing." He settled into the chair, looking young and serious. "You regrettin' bringin' me home yet?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret studied his face, seeing no self-pity or manipulation, just genuine curiosity and perhaps a touch of resignation, as though he was already prepared for her answer. "No," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Though I suspect I should be." "Why don't you?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, considering. "Because everything you said tonight was true. Charles Whitman is a pompous fool, his wife is cruel under all that elegance, and James Porter is a drunk who gets his entertainment from hurting people weaker than himself. But they're important folks. Influential. Yes, they are." Margaret pulled a small object from her desk drawer, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its familiar weight. "Do you know how I built this ranch, Tommy? Hard work, I reckon. And bein' smarter than the competition. That's part of it. But the real secret was learning to play their game. I smiled when I wanted to scream, agreed when I wanted to argue, and pretended to be grateful for scraps when I deserved the whole meal." She looked up at him. "I've spent 15 years being exactly who they expected me to be, and I'd convinced myself it was worth it." Tommy tilted his head, studying her with that unnerving perception. "What changed your mind?" "A 12-year-old boy who had the courage to tell them what I never could." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the lamplight casting warm shadows around the room. Finally, Tommy spoke. "My stepfather used to say I was too smart for my own good. Said I saw things that weren't my business to see." Margaret set down the locket. "What kinds of things?" "Like how he'd come home happy after drinking with his buddies, but mean after drinking alone. How my ma would make excuses for the bruises but never look me in the eye when she did it. How the preacher's wife would smile real sweet while she was tellin' folks about other people's sins." Tommy's voice remained steady, matter of fact. "Learned early that most grown-ups don't want children tellin' them hard truths." "Is that why you spoke up tonight? Because you thought I needed to hear it?" Tommy considered this. "Partly. But mostly because they were being cruel to you, and I don't much like bullies." The simple honesty of it hit Margaret like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had defended her? When had anyone seen past her wealth and reputation to the person underneath? "You realize what this means, don't you?" she asked. "After tonight, we'll both be outcasts. The association will make sure of it." "Good riddance," Tommy said with a shrug. "Rather be honest outcasts than lying insiders." Margaret found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. "You know, I think you might be right. Don't mean it'll be easy though. Folks like them don't forgive being shown up, especially by people they think are beneath them." "No, they don't." Margaret stood and moved to the window, looking out at her land, thousands of acres she'd fought to acquire and hold. "But maybe it's time I stopped caring what they think." Tommy joined her at the window. "You scared?" Margaret glanced down at him, this boy who'd somehow managed to see straight to her heart. "Terrified." "That means it matters." They stood side by side, looking out at the ranch that was both her greatest achievement and her fortress against the world. For the first time, it occurred to Margaret that maybe she didn't need the fortress anymore. "Tommy," she said quietly, "when I first saw you in town, what did you think of me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Thought you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen, dressed up fancy to hide it. Reminded me of myself, except I never had enough money to make it look pretty. The observation was so accurate, so devastating in its simplicity, that Margaret had to grip the windowsill to steady herself. Did you know, she whispered, that in 15 years of living in this house, you're the first person who's ever had an honest conversation with me in this room? That's a shame. It's a nice room for talkin'. Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised them both. Yes, it is. They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories and truths they'd never told anyone. Tommy spoke about the homes he'd lived in, the adults who'd failed him, the walls he'd built to protect himself. Margaret found herself describing the loneliness of success, the weight of always having to be strong, the desperate hunger for genuine connection. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Tommy yawned and stretched. Reckon I should get some sleep. Tomorrow's gonna be interesting. Why do you say that? Tommy grinned, the first completely carefree expression she'd seen from him. Well, after last night, half the territory's gonna want to run us out of town. Other half's gonna want to see what we do next. And what are we going to do next? Whatever we want, I reckon. Ain't that the beauty of not having to please anybody but ourselves? As Tommy headed upstairs, Margaret remained by the window, watching the sun rise over her land. For 15 years, she'd built her empire by playing by other people's rules, seeking approval from people who would never truly accept her. Maybe it was time to write her own rules. Word of the dinner incident spread through Cedar Ridge faster than a grass fire. By noon the next day, Margaret had received visits from 3 concerned neighbors, 2 angry creditors who'd suddenly decided her accounts needed reviewing, and 1 very satisfied Jake Morrison. Best entertainment I've had in years, Jake declared, settling into a chair on the front porch where Margaret sat with her morning coffee. Whole town's buzzing about it. Tommy's made quite an impression. The wrong kind of impression, I'm afraid. Maybe. Or maybe the right kind for the right people. Jake tipped his hat back and grinned. Betty Murphy told me she's been wanting to say something about James Porter's drinking for months. Said Tommy gave voice to what half the town's been thinking. Margaret set down her cup. And the other half? Well, they're madder than wet hens. Whitman's been holding court at the hotel all morning, talking about proper respect and social order. Jake's expression grew more serious. He's calling for a vote of no confidence at the next association meeting. I see. Margaret had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the stomach. How many do you think will support him? Enough, probably. Fear's a powerful motivator, and you've always made folks nervous, woman with that much power and independence. Now they got an excuse to try and cut you down to size. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A small group of riders was coming up the drive, not the hostile delegation she'd expected, but something more surprising. Leading them was Sarah Chin, the Chinese woman who ran a successful farm on the outskirts of town despite facing constant prejudice, followed by Miguel Santos, Maria's husband who operated the territory's only blacksmith shop, and surprisingly, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, Porter Hayes' own daughter. Miss Thornfield, Sarah called as they dismounted. Might we have a word? Margaret rose, uncertain what to expect. These were not people she knew well, respected members of the community but not part of the inner circle that typically sought her attention. Of course. Please, come up. As they settled on the porch, Margaret noticed Tommy watching from the barn where he'd been helping with the horses. His expression was alert but not worried, as though he'd been expecting this visit. We heard about last night, Dr. Hayes began. About what the boy said. Margaret braced herself for another lecture about proper child rearing and social expectations. We wanted to thank him, Sarah continued, surprising her. And you, for not silencing him. I'm sorry. Miguel leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. Senora, for years we've watched the association treat people like dirt if they don't fit their idea of what's proper. Chinese, Mexican, women who dare to think for themselves, we're all outsiders to them. But we've never had anyone with your influence willing to stand up to them, Dr. Hayes added. Last night changed something. Sarah nodded. The boy saw what we all see but were afraid to say. And you supported him instead of backing down. That took courage. Margaret felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. You're not here to tell me I was wrong? You were the first person to be right in years, Dr. Hayes said firmly. My father's been drinking himself into rages for as long as I can remember, but nobody talks about it because he's important. Your boy called it what it is. He's not afraid of them, Miguel observed. And neither are you not anymore. Jake, who'd been listening quietly, now spoke up. They want to form something new. Alternative to the association for folks who don't fit their narrow ideas. A mutual aid society, Sarah explained. People helping people without all the politics and prejudice. Sharing resources, supporting each other's businesses, standing together when one of us faces trouble. Margaret looked out at Tommy, who was now openly listening from the barn doorway. When he caught her eye, he smiled and gave her a small nod of encouragement. What would you need from me? She asked. Your land for meetings, if you're willing. Your influence with the bank and suppliers. Most importantly, your willingness to show others that there's another way to do business in this territory. Margaret thought of all the years she'd spent seeking approval from people who would never truly accept her, who saw her success as an aberration to be tolerated rather than celebrated. When do we start? The next few hours passed in a blur of planning and discussion. More people arrived throughout the afternoon. The widow Peterson who ran a boarding house for travelers, the German immigrants who'd been struggling to establish their furniture-making business, even old Pete from the livery stable. By evening, they had the framework for something unprecedented in Cedar Ridge, a community organization based on mutual respect rather than social hierarchy. As the last visitors departed, Margaret found herself alone with Tommy on the porch again. The boy had participated in the discussions with remarkable insight, offering practical suggestions and asking thoughtful questions. This is what you saw, isn't it? She asked. When you first met me in town. Not just my loneliness, but the possibility for something different. Tommy shrugged, but she could see the satisfaction in his eyes. Saw you were tired of pretendin' to be someone you're not. Figured if you stopped pretendin', other folks might feel brave enough to do the same. And if I'd chosen differently? If I'd tried to make you conform instead? Then I'd have moved on eventually. Always do. His voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. But I'm glad you didn't. Like it here. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. I'm glad too. More glad than I can say. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land that no longer felt like a fortress but like home. In the distance, Margaret could see lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of Cedar Ridge, and for the first time in years, she felt connected to the community rather than isolated from it. Tommy, she said quietly, what you did last night, standing up for me. Family stands up for family, he interrupted simply. That's what you do. Family. The words settled around Margaret's heart like a warm blanket. Not the family she'd tried to buy or manufacture, but the real thing, built on truth and trust and the courage to see each other clearly. Yes, she said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. That's exactly what you do. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret Thornfield realized that for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. 3 months later, the Thornfield Ranch hosted the first official gathering of the Cedar Ridge Mutual Aid Society. The barn had been decorated with simple wildflowers and colorful bunting, and tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by families from across the territory. It was a far cry from the formal elegance of the Cattlemen's Association dinner, but the laughter and genuine warmth filling the space made it infinitely more appealing. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching Tommy help Mrs. Chen's youngest daughter reach the dessert table while Dr. Hayes discussed medical techniques with Miguel's wife. In 3 months, this unlikely group had accomplished more genuine good than the association had managed in years, establishing a fund for families in crisis, organizing barn raisings for struggling neighbors, and creating a network of support that crossed all the traditional social boundaries. Penny for your thoughts, Jake said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of punch. Just thinking about how much has changed." Margaret accepted the cup gratefully. 6 months ago, I thought success meant being accepted by people who barely tolerated me. Now you've got real friends and a family that chose you back." Margaret's eyes found Tommy across the room, deep in conversation with old Pete about the proper care of horses. The boy had thrived in the months since the dinner, growing not just physically but in confidence and joy. The wary calculation in his eyes had been replaced by the easy warmth of a child who knew he was safe and loved.